Hello student, welcome to the lecture on human resource practices and programs in various countries, and after this lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Understand the applicability of HR model, discuss about various models, describe the HRM policies in various countries, understand the European model of HRM. Introduction. Let's start with a brief introduction to the topic human resource practices and programs in various countries. Human resources are the source of achieving competitive advantage because of its capability to convert the other resources, money, machine, methods and material into output, product or service. According to Catry, people are one of the most important factors providing flexibility and adaptability to organization. Story defines HRM as a distinctive approach to employment management which seeks to obtain competitive advantage through the deployment of a highly committed and skilled workforce using an array of techniques. HRM practices refer to organizational activities directed at managing the pool of human resources and ensuring that the resources are employed towards the fulfillment of organizational goals.
I hate my job.
I'm here to complain about my boss.
I hate my boss.
How my job is. I hate my boss.
You know what? You're a sad old man.
I hate my new boss.
She's a total bitch and I hate her.
And that's why I hate my boss.
Seriously, the guy's insane.
The other thing that Google has done remarkably well is to hire smart people.
There's 21,640 men and women who have dedicated their lives to keeping the lights on in the 11 states that we do business.
You got to make sure you have a strong organization that's capable of making the decisions it needs to make.
Human resources, human capital, the people. If you've said if you want a job done properly, do it yourself more than twice this year, HR have the solution. It's more than a quicksand of red flags, lawsuits and pointless rules. Done right, HR is a game changer. Like every business discipline, HR has its actors, the people who change the definition of what's expected. When David Fairhurst joined McDonald's, the fast food giant was in the news for all the wrong reasons. McJobs, McLibel and McMorgan Spurlock.
I experienced that at most dinner parties that I went to, where people, good or bad, would have an opinion.
Most people had a very bad opinion about McJobs in particular and the people that were in them, but David saw something else.
And that was at odds with the pride, the commitment, the training that I saw when I came inside this organisation.
Turning that around was and is a huge task, but while the rehabilitation of the Golden Arches may not be complete, profits and perceptions are on the up. It started, says David, by addressing the issue of what HR calls itself.
For years, if not a decade, HR has been very self-indulgent around what it calls itself, whether it deserves a seat at the table. And quite frankly, it needs to earn its seat at the table. And in my view, it needs to be less self-indulgent about looking at its name and its purpose. What HR should be talking about, rather than what it calls itself, is around how do you truly understand what it is that your business needs? What's the engine around people that drives your business performance? How can you get more sales and profitability from people? And then secondly, what is it that your people truly value about working for your organisation, to really understand what it is that differentiates you as an employer?
Bring those two things together, says David, and you create an energy that can be released around your people. And when you do that, the HR department can talk about
what is the future talent needs of our organisation? How can we generate better insight around people? How can we get rid of organisational silos that destroy progress in an organisation? How can we support change in business? How do we support leaders in terms of integrity, values-based leadership?
This programme may not yet be offering a completely balanced diet, but Misty Reich, HR Director for KFC, agrees with David.
First, you need to understand what is it that the business is trying to accomplish? What is the core strategy? And then from that point, do you start talking about how the people resources in that business can drive towards that?
One of HR's many key roles is to ensure continuity in an organisation. Non-incremental change to encourage progress, incremental change to encourage growth, fresh blood and steady hands. It's a difficult balancing act, and one which toy manufacturer Mattel focused on intently following some acquisition-based culture shock.
Even Fisher-Price, that had been an acquisition for earlier, had its own and distinct culture. We had just bought the American Girl Company in Madison, Wisconsin, had its own and distinct culture. And it's very hard to develop people in an environment like that. And I think that's what we were facing. So early on, the key was, how do we create, without destroying the individual entrepreneurship that was going on in these locations?
One part of the solution was a process Mattel called
the Quality of Organization Review.
Every year, the senior management from all divisions, with their heads of HR, present to Alan and Mattel's CEO
how their organization is doing, what their organization issues are, who are the key people, who are the people at the very senior levels, and who are behind them. We have these extensive reviews going on, and as you can imagine, if that's going on at the senior-most level of the organization, it filters down, so it's going on through the organization. And then we take that review, Mr. Eckert and myself, and we do this with the board, probably twice a year, where we review the senior-most talent of the organization with the board, so they know who they are. They get to see them during presentations. So we really make this succession planning process that we have very, very much a piece of everything we do here.
At McDonald's, David Fairhurst believes succession planning is also integral to the business, but not in its current, most common form.
The reality is that that is not dynamic enough to meet the ongoing needs of the organisation. What you need to be doing is to be thinking about strategic workforce planning. So in other words, what are the operational income drivers of your organisation over the next, say, 3 to 5 years? Working in a non-silo way with your business intelligence, your business strategy people, to figure out what's going to drive the profitability. And then very simply to map your talent capability against those drivers of the business. So my call really is, if you're going to meet the business needs both now and in the future, we need to be far more dynamic, fluid if you like, and non-siloed in the way in which we approach talent in organisations. And that requires, I think, a different attitude towards talent.
But with a word of warning, here's Alan Kay. Be careful what you wish for.
I would say that early on, hiring in at maybe senior manager and above, we'd probably hire in from the outside about 75% of the talent coming from the outside of the organization. There was almost a philosophy of, you need new blood, you need new ideas, bring it in from the outside versus develop from within. We need to turn that around. And we spend a lot of time with leadership development. We spend a lot of time in succession planning now, understanding who's ready for the next move, what do they need, and when. And we've really come full circle. Now I'd say we're about 90% promotions are from within, 10% from the outside. And as an HR professional, I would say we're probably swung the pendulum a little too far.
That you should always invest in your people may sound like a no-brainer, but
you get a lot of people in over the years say, if you invest in people, they leave the organisation. How do you get your return on investment?
When the truth of the matter is,
the more you give people transferable skills, the less likely they are to transfer.
For a frankly brilliant example of what can be achieved when you strive for best practice and are creative with your investment in people, we move from potato chips to silicon chips, from Big Mac to Big Blue, I think you get the picture. IBM has combined leadership training and social responsibility to incredible effect.
What was clear to me at IBM is that we had some unique capabilities, and again, our innovation and our technology, but then clearer and clearer to me, it was our people, the talent within the company.
The result? A corporate Peace Corps or corporate service corps, to give it the correct IBM title. And this is what great HR can do for your business.
A corporate service corps, and yes, we do characterize it as a corporate version of the Peace Corps, is fundamentally about leadership and leadership development. What the corporate service corps offers to our best emerging leaders within the company, this is 500 people selected in a very competitive way in each year, and they're assigned in teams of 8 to 10 in communities in Nigeria or Ghana, and they work as a team, living together, working on a critical social problem, usually connected to economic growth, job development, using their technical skills, working as a team of people. So at the end of that process, what we've identified is people have completely improved their teaming skills, their cultural adaptability, their understanding of growth markets, their understanding of the relationship between government, business, and the not-for-profit sector.
And that's not even the best of it.
And then there's another advantage that perhaps you might not have thought about going into it. In an independent evaluation done by the Harvard Business School, 100% of the participants in the Corporate Service Corps indicated that participation in this program increased their likelihood of completing their career at IBM.
Various models of human resource management. Various models of HRM have been developed from time to time by different teams of the researchers. Some of the important models have been discussed as follows. Harvard model. The Harvard model works as a strategic map to guide all managers in their relation with employees and concentrate on the human or soft aspect of HRM. It works on the premise that employees needed to be congruent, competent, and cost-effective. Michigan model. The Michigan model focuses on hard HRM. According to this model, selection, appraisal, development, and rewards were geared towards organizational performance. Guess model. Guess comparative model works on the premise that a set of integrated HRM practices will result to superior individual and organizational performance. It advocates a significant difference of HRM from PM. Warwick model. This model was developed by Henry and Pettigrew at Center for Strategy and Change, Warwick University in early 1190s. It emphasizes on analytical approach to HRM. It also recognizes the impact of the role of the personal functions on the human resource strategy content. Management practices, China, US, and Japan. Productivity levels are of great concern to every country on the face of the earth. In recent years, many US businesses have looked to Japan to find the answer to the productivity crisis in the United States, while many Japanese scholars attend universities in the United States to learn about management. Japan's phenomenal success in increasing productivity is often attributed to its managerial approach and low wage rates. Since Japan and the United States present contrasting managerial approaches, Chinese managers probably could adopt aspects from either approach. In Japan, planning is greatly aided by cooperation between government and business. The Japanese in general have a longer-term orientation in planning than US managers. One reason for this is that in Japan, banks are the primary providers of capital and the interest is the long-term health of the businesses. In contrast, US managers are often under pressure by stockholders to show favorable financial ratios each time they report them. One of the most interesting aspects of Japanese management is the way decisions are made. In China, major decisions are made by people at the top, but many people are involved in operational decisions. In Japanese companies, largely due to the search for consensus in decision making, the emphasis is on collective responsibility and accountability. Chinese managerial practices are very much influenced by the fact that the businesses are owned by the state and guided by government officials. Management of human resources in the United States is quite different from the same practice in Japan. Like the Japanese, US companies recruit employees from schools, but they also hire from other companies. A common practice in US companies is to appraise the performance of new employees comparatively soon after they are hired. Promotion in US companies are based primarily on individual performance. In Japan, employees are promoted slowly through the ranks with regular salary increases. The managerial function of leading in China has characteristic of Japanese and US practices. Leader is the head of the group in committees, for example, but the leadership style is generally quite directive. Management, once considered a US challenge to Europeans, has become, in the minds of many, a Japanese challenge to managers in the United States. HRM and the European Union. The EU also sets political frames for the development of HRM activities within Europe and has to be seen as an important collective actor and major change driver affecting individuals, organizations, and national states.
More educated and more affluent, they become softer in what they are looking for. If you are as an individual, you are first generation in university. If your cousins and aunts and uncles have paid for you to become a doctor, let us say, and you finally have become a physician, you are the first doctor that has ever been known in the whole of that family tree. It is a cause for the whole of that community to celebrate, and they will look for you to be helping them economically and in an appropriate way, and you would consider it your duty to do that, your moral duty to do that, not only to repay, but to be a blessing to the family at points of great need and crisis. And I promise you this, such an individual is not likely to be talking about work-life balance. I'm exaggerating a little. But if you are second or third generation, your grandfather was a university professor, your mother was a lawyer, your father also was a very successful businessman, and you inherited part share of the business. You know, that generation, if it's your child now growing up, your child is the person who's thinking at the age of 23, is saying, I'm thinking of downsizing and getting a life. You think downsizing at the age of 23? You're still at university, my friend. Because this is a different generation. And they are thinking differently, and they are feeling much more soft about many of these things. And they're much more looking for purpose and meaning at work than perhaps the first generation through, who are prepared to live and almost die for just to get there, to succeed, to get in there and make it happen. And I've seen that over and over again in many, many of the countries where we work.
HR activities are becoming more and more important to companies' strengthening of the economic position, since they can be linked directly to organizational value creation. Increased people mobility will give companies the opportunity to recruit globally and to allocate work more efficiently. More systematically, EU policy with a more or less indirect impact on HRM can be associated with four major policy domains: employment policy, education policy, competition policy, and economy policy. Four paradigms and concepts to work with. With regard to our located need for discussion and research framework, we start with the relevant paradigms and concept to explain the development of future HRM for Europe. Universalistic paradigm and the concept of best practice. The universalistic paradigm, which is dominant in the USA, is an approach of social science to use generalization in an abstract and law-like manner. The contextual paradigm and the concept of contingency. The contextual paradigm searches for differences between and within HRM in various contexts and what the antecedents of those differences are. The paradigm emphasizes external factors as well as the action of the management within the firm. Since European countries have different cultures, and since there are strong arguments supporting the hypothesis that these differences will remain or will even increase, all this leads us to a process of divergence, the minimal group paradigm and the concept of identity. Tajfel, Billig and Bundy brought the idea of the minimal group paradigm to the force of European social psychology. The studies of the minimal group paradigm were meant to explicate the baseline condition for intergroup discrimination, the strategic paradigm and the concept of competitive advantage. It has been argued that there is a direct connection between strategic HRM and economic success. One of the most well-known typologies of strategies developed by Porter has served as a basic for theory development in HR strategy as well. Framework of HRM in Europe. According to the theoretical background discussed before, we can extend these suggestions and put together a framework that explains the current and future development of HRM in Europe. This framework is made up of the four paradigms and the four concepts of HRM. These activities are driven by culture and result in divergence. In the middle, we see the strategic paradigm with the concept of competitive advantage and the minimal group paradigm with the concept of identity. Market-driven developments. The first important driver is the market. This holds true both for the concept of best practice as well as, at least partially, for the concept of competitive advantage. Contrary to the belief of Friedman, these levels need not necessarily be at a low level. One other trend in European countries is that the extent of outsourcing of HR activities, while substantial, has not changed much from its traditional levels. The use of EHRM is still in the future in most organizations, and unsurprisingly, therefore, the size of the HR department in comparison with all the other employees has changed little.
This new field and these new potentials to people on the level of policy making, people who are looking to implement and harness some of this creative and energy and also economic energy. I was wondering if you could give an example of some of these ways that you have sort of negotiated within this new field of explaining to people who might not understand this confluence of different sectors and the potential for what it can do.
I think this is the hardest part of my job, because the problem is that most of the policymakers have a very limited span of attention, and they love to think of themselves as practical persons, which is the worst, because as practical, this means that they cannot listen to any elaborated kind of reasoning because this is not practical enough. The problem is that to understand what's going on, not necessarily you can explain everything in 30 seconds. You cannot explain the law of gravity in 30 seconds. You need at least 1 minute. So if you are not 1 minute of attention span, you are lost for the law of gravity. Well, this is something similar in my case. So my first problem is how to capture their attention long enough that they can at least understand what we are speaking about. But the second point is to make them time consistent, because probably once you have them in front of you, and probably you also use some crypto-hypnotical kind of skills, but once you have them in front of you, you manage to convince them, let's say this. But then when you walk away and they take their everyday decisions, very easily they can undo exactly what you have been steadily and obstinately try to construct with them, which means that they think they are deciding along what was agreed or along what was planned, but they do something completely different. In particular, what they tend to evaluate of something that they can understand and appreciate is the economic impact of things. But the problem is that the economic impact of things has to be measured, and in some cases it's tricky. And it's even more complicated the fact that the real benefits of cultural-driven development has to do with the indirect effects. For example, we know today that if we manage to make people comfortable with the idea of having regular access to cultural experiences, especially, let's say, the elderly, this changes completely, for example, their frequency of access to the hospital. In a place like Europe, which is an aging continent, this means that, for example, if you can drop by, let's say, 5%, which is a prudent estimate, the hospitalization rate, if you just implement systematic cultural policies addressing the needs of the elderly, in macroeconomic terms, you are changing European macroeconomy. But I mean, to explain this, you need at least 1 minute. And after this, you have to stick to their mind the idea that this is not simply wasting money on things that don't have economic impact. The economic impact is huge, but you have to have the perception of the causal chain that creates this. This is difficult. I must say that especially in the Italian experience, which has been for me not the only one, but of course I'm working extensively in many countries at the moment, but of course I maintain my reference to Italy as the place where I teach, where I live, and I would hope, by the way, that Italy, with this kind of undisputable culturally based identity, would become a place for successful experimentation of this kind of models. But still, I must say that it's very difficult to find Italian policy and decision makers that really get a point.
Can you illustrate an example of an experience with a situation like that?
Examples, in the case of Italy, for example, the failure examples tend to be very similar to each other, and generally there are examples like this. For example, I had this project in Vicenza, which is one of the cradles of Italian architecture. In particular, is the hometown of Andrea Palladio, that, by the way, was recently recognized also as the father of American architecture through the Monticello connection, Jefferson, all that. And Palladio built this wonderful, magnificent building in the center of the city, which is the Basilica. that was abandoned for a while. It was restored with the money of the local bank foundation, and initially I managed to convince, for example, not only the town hall but also the entrepreneurs of one of the most intensive entrepreneurial provinces in Italy in terms of concentration of business, and especially of creative business. I managed to convince them that this could become a creative hub. So not simply a place where to make the big event, the blockbuster exhibition. In Italy you have this mania of blockbuster exhibitions because they are easy to communicate and the balance sheet is clearly readable. There are so many people visiting the show and this is the proceeds. So it's easy. But of course it's also very, very ephemeral. Once it's over, it's over. Whereas it would be much more interesting to have a place that produces constantly culture and produces creative contents on an entrepreneurial basis. So I managed to convince the local stakeholders that that was the case. But when the project was completed, the people, in this case the foundation that financed the project, they decided that they wanted a blockbuster exhibition. And since they were providing the money, of course there was no question, no argument. And the whole project was turned upside down, and all the work that we did, almost 2 years of careful focusing on the territory, explaining this to so many different stakeholders and convincing them, making them excited, was burnt in the space of 1 week. This is very frustrating. On the other hand, I think that, well, you have to be very careful with the place that you choose, but there can be cases in which the work can be done in a more stable, sustainable way. Well, Italy is, politically speaking, just to remain at the Italian level, it's very turbulent at the moment. So stable is a bit too much, as a bit overstretched kind of description. But for example, I'm now working as the director of the bid for the city of Siena for the 2019 European Culture Capital competition, which will elect an Italian city as the European Culture Capital in 2019. And for example, in the case of Siena, although again political turmoil is the case because even the mayor had to resign for the political conflict over there, and now we have a governmental officer in taking the place of the mayor. So turbulent situation, but at the same time a situation in which I see that in a situation of deep crisis, a place like that has in the province as many as 4 UNESCO heritage sites, is at the same time willing to go for it, and with a very broad I think distribution of competencies and skills and responsibilities that are really committing to making of culture an engine for future development of the place. Well, again, we have no guarantee of how it ends because probably it never ends. Probably you just start the process and then you look at what happens, and probably at some time the process goes on its own feet. Of course, it's not necessary that you are there, managing the process the whole time. But of course, my dream is that there could be situations that are viable in this respect. I've been working with situations where actually things went out nicely. For example, I'm cooperating a lot with in Europe places like Lille or like the Ruhr. There are places that were successful European culture capital and where culture-led development really made a difference. But I must say that there the quality of the political governance is absolutely outstanding, and this was definitely a decisive element for ensuring the sustainability of the process. In many places, especially in Mediterranean Europe at the moment, at the European level, the situation is more complicated, and finding this level of governance is objectively more difficult.
Why look at the revitalization of Siena in terms of culture? Why not in terms of something else?
That's a very good question. Because I think that once the traditional local economy has been dismantled, and it was a rent economy based basically on the presence of the bank, that was one of the hugest banks in Italy and the most ancient in the world. Once the bank went into serious crisis, you readily understand that this is not a manufacturing economy. The entrepreneurial spirit of the city has been completely destroyed by years of a rent economy. And when you're there, what you really see around you is the potential of this, not only of this cultural heritage, but the incredible emotional tension that this cultural heritage creates, which is not simply a background for tourist photographs, but is an ideal context for generation of new ideas, for bringing the city back to the days in which it was one of the global hubs of cultural creation in the world. Well, it's a long time ago, but the city is a city that reasons in the long term. You can imagine that still every year, basically, they celebrate the year and the date of the defeat of Florence in the Sienese-Florentine War, and it was, 1260. So this is a city with a long memory. So we can actually hope for restoring this lost spirit, I think, in this new situation.
And in terms of applying this type of thinking and this type of stimulation, economic stimulation through culture, to other areas that don't have the same cultural background that Siena has, how do we think about that?
That's, I think, is one of the real frontiers of the future. Today there are so many contexts where culture is really becoming one of the big options. In some cases, it has to do with the de-industrialized cities that want to manage their post-industrial transition. And by the way, the successful examples so far especially come from this category of cities. But especially in the emerging countries, there are cities that are either no cultural identity and history whatsoever, or they have one that has not really been cultivated for several reasons in the past decades or even centuries. So in these cases you have a sort of blank space in front of you, and you have to, of course it cannot be a sort of top-down thing in which, like an orchestra, you go there and you design a wonderful building. First of all, you have to reactivate culturally the local community, and this is very difficult, and this requires a very diverse and complex set of skills that by the way, I think no single individual can have. So that's another interesting issue. Working in this kind of context, you have to grow very good teams and very interdisciplinary teams that are very well experienced and trained to work together on these issues. But I think that in this particular context, we have really one of the big opportunities for the future, because these places tend to understand often more than in Western countries how culture can make a difference culturally, because they don't have the prejudices that we have. For example, in Europe, we have had centuries of subsidized culture. So of course we tend to think that culture should be subsidized. And we don't get, for example, the real potential of cultural industries. In the United States, they get the potential of cultural industries because in some sense the nation is born with more or less concurrently with the development of culture and creative industries. But for example, in the United States, it's difficult to believe that there can be a future for cultural production outside of the market. That's one of the reasons why, for example, the American cultural industries are so focused on copyright issues and defense on the monopoly on creation and distribution of contents. I think that in these new countries, you have an enormous mental flexibility for the possibilities that are opened by the new scenario, which is a scenario in which practically everybody today is not simply a part of the cultural audience, but is a cultural producer. Every teenager with a laptop today has the potential to make sophisticated sound production and editing, sophisticated video production and editing, and whatever, and they use it. I mean, it's very easy to see how this is going to be used, and of course there is a huge debate about the fact that most of this stuff is interesting or not, but these are absolutely pointless debates. Of course, it's a field of experimentation, and when millions of people are attempting to produce contents, most of it will not be interesting for other people, but that is not the point. The point is that we are changing completely the ecology of culture, which is not based anymore on a distinction between who produces and who uses, but is simply an ecology in which all people switch roles depending to the context. And this is interesting because it means that, for example, you can produce and circulate contents outside the market, and this could even have good economic sense. We are just starting to explore the economic models that can make this sustainable, but it's not necessary that all kind of contents should be sold and bought on the market to create social and economic value. These new countries are much more open than we are to these new perspectives, because for them, I mean, they are just beginning now, and if this is the status quo, it's much more natural for them to accept the status quo than it is for us Europeans or for the Americans that have, in some sense, some background, very strong preformatted attitude towards how to produce and circulate culture.
Culture-driven developments. Another driving force is culture, which is to be seen at the local, regional, national and supranational levels. This culture has at least two effects. It has to be considered as a contingency and it has to be seen as something every group is developing over time. Summary. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Employers are realizing that the success of an organization relies on more than hiring qualified candidates. Effective human resource, HR planning and management is required at all stages of an employee's corporate life cycle to help ensure employee growth and satisfaction. Employee satisfaction is vital to the success of an organization because of its direct impact on productivity. When employees are satisfied, they are more likely to produce high-quality work, optimize performance, and exercise more critical thought and creativity. This combination of high satisfaction and maximum productivity amounts to employee engagement.